his book, The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days in the Triumph of Hope, John Alter reveals the underlying influences and significance of FDR's first 100 days in office, as well as the consequences for the United States and the culmination of FDR's defining moment. While unprecedentedly liberal in its foundation, the New Deal swiftly manifested as an economic policy for America during FDR's first administration, due to its originator's innate abilities to manage criticism with grace, to expound his advantageous ideas boldly, and to enlist the support of the forgotten man through promises of prosperity. Former experience, past failure, and observation allowed FDR to appeal to the public, as he understood their concerns and the actions necessary to deliver a hope of salvation from the Depression. With the help of his advisors and family, FDR altered the course of American history through his revolutionary policies in economics, politics, and social relations, defining himself en route of defining America for generations to come. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, popularly known as FDR, was born January 30, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York. Out of the womb, Franklin was blue and not breathing, seemingly a stillborn. After resuscitation, however, he came around. Thus the miracle baby became the center of his mother's attention. His mother, Sarah, nurtured his self-confidence from his childhood to his ascent as the president. Franklin's father, James, suffered a heart attack in 1891, testing the strength of Franklin's will to care for others and to comfort his mother. The incident helped Franklin develop an even tighter bond with his mother and a new ability to relate to those in need, indeed a skill that came in handy later in his life as a presidential candidate and leader. After serious courtship, Franklin married Anna Eleanor Roosevelt on March 17, 1905. Eleanor, along with her mother-in-law, would build Franklin's self-confidence and his capability as a leader, while slowly pushing forward her sensitivity against social injustices. In Eleanor, Franklin found the perfect partner for political undertakings. In 1910, Franklin was elected to the New York State Senate, defeating Tammany Hall's Choice Sheehan. With this, Franklin began his political career. As one of the main supporters of Woodrow Wilson in his campaign, Franklin was dutifully paid in his appointment as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in April of 1913. In his tenure, Franklin expanded the Navy greatly, pushing his hawkish views on military intervention to the center stage. From such a young politician in high office, Roosevelt's actions reflected an innate ability to force his ideas into conversation and economic reform. The Democratic Party nominated James A. Cox to run on the 44th ballot as their presidential candidate in 1920 against Senator Warren G. Harding. Cox, believing that an energetic young Roosevelt might win some progressive Republican votes, selected Franklin as his running mate. Harding, nonetheless, rode to a landslide victory despite Franklin's ability as a speech giver, but Roosevelt began to develop a connection with the people of the United States before he endeavored to run for himself. Perhaps the most life-altering experience of his life arrived in 1921, when Franklin was diagnosed with infantile paralysis. The enthusiastic young man would never walk normally for the rest of his life. However, the ghastly affliction, as his relatives described it in embarrassment, allowed Franklin to cultivate loquaciousness and defined reverence for the forgotten man. Without this, Franklin could never have appealed to Americans in the 1932 election as he did, nor would he have harbored extraordinary patience, acceptance, and vigor in office. With Al Smith campaigning heartily in the 1928 presidential election, Franklin was inspired, after receiving a phone call from Smith himself, to run in the 1928 gubernatorial elections for New York State. Challenging critics of his polio diagnosis, Franklin overcame the odds and won the vote. From this stature in politics, Franklin propelled himself into the national spotlight as an early contender for the next presidential election, leaving Al Smith, the incumbent governor, to wallow in his own misery after losing the presidential vote. Al's failure subconsciously motivated Franklin to grudge a personal vendetta against his natural indolence, as Smith, a decade older, represented all of the people in Franklin's life who underestimated him, belittled his skills, and thought he was too weak to be president. A mama's boy, an awkward child with a sick father, a denounced engagement, an upstart, Harvard-bred dilettante, a boldly irrational politician, a corkscrew amateur, a physically and mentally crippled mortal. And yet, faced with criticisms, Franklin assumed his birthright to provide for the people. Any signs of an inferiority complex dissipated as he matured in his ground as a politician. Beneath the sheen of privilege lay not just a talent for manipulation, but uncommon determination, and the adversity merely strengthened this. And through this examination of FDR's resolve to battle endless critiques, Alter provides the basis of how FDR was able to effectively push his rash and revolutionary liberal ideas to the forefront of American politics and economics in the 100-Day Congress. All together, shout it now, there's no 1932. The year of the highest unemployment rates in the history of the United States at the time. More than 16 million Americans, nearly 25% of the workforce, found themselves without jobs. Of the remaining 75%, more than a third were working only part-time. In October of 1929, the New York Stock Exchange crashed, and although the crash did not directly affect many Americans, as very few invested in the stocks, the resulting deflation took its toll, as the Fed's restrictive money supply, the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and the adherence to the gold standard all proved disastrous. Alter relates to the audience the severe conditions of the Great Depression and then elaborates even further, noting President Herbert Hoover's failure to resolve the crisis. The great humanitarian was weak-minded, with inefficient confidence in his ideas and himself. His strict prescription of balanced budgets, tax increases, and strict adherence to the gold standard diminished hopes of a soon recovery. From here, Alter notes, is when the do-nothing president offered the chance of a lifetime for the Democrats to capture the White House. Although presiding over the economic collapse of the late 1920s and early 1930s, Hoover was still viewed as the economic expert in comparison to Franklin, as was Al Smith, who was campaigning to win the Democratic nomination. To improve the substance of his stances on national issues, Franklin recruited his personal Privy Council, which we know today as the Brain Trust. These men both greatly assisted Franklin on his campaigns for the presidency, as well as served as the architects for the first 100 days. As Franklin secured the Democratic nomination for president on the fourth ballot, he personally flew from his New York campaigning location to Chicago to greet the Democratic National Convention. Here, Franklin, with the extensive help of his Brain Trust, delivered the promise of the New Deal, which all discovered later to be a sweeping set of reforms in economic policy that reflected an asserted liberalness. This promise of prosperity ignited Franklin's campaign and awarded him the grand prize of presidential election. Thus, Alter's argument that the revolution of economic policy in the New Deal was the deciding factor for the election of FDR was affirmed on November 8, 1932, when FDR won in a landslide. The winter of 1933 proved the most terrifying of the Great Depression, when crises of all sorts astounded the nation. Alter implies that the uncertainty, however, in the progressive voice of Franklin started to melt away that winter, as everything righted itself into place for the president-elect and his New Deal. Nearly assassinated, Franklin remained fearless in the face of death, carrying his composure and calm regards as he cradled a wounded man. With reassurances to the man that everything would be all right that day, Franklin made an impression on Americans who were wounded by the Depression, and that he would offer them the same kind of sincerity and assurances of recovery. Lorena Hickok eased Eleanor's fears of becoming First Lady, and allowed her to realize her full potential as one of the greatest First Ladies in the history of the United States, which greatly increased Franklin's confidence in his ability as a leader, as he was leading a solid political marriage at the time. Hoover's failure that winter also provided the stepping stone for Franklin's ascent. Franklin, sensing the urgency of direction for the American public, came to believe that the medicine for stability of America was a practical dictatorship through federal spending and intervention. Large banking failures, even in the streets of New York, rocked the nation that winter. While Hoover feared a national banking holiday, as it represented the closure of all banks and hope for recovery, Franklin esteemed the idea, as he could forwardly institute his new policies. As dawn broke on Saturday, March 4, 1933, the United States resembled FDR on that day in 1921, as he lay paralyzed with illness and fear. A few elderly men and women had dim memories of the Civil War, 70 years earlier. No one else could bring to mind anything so frightening in the life of the nation. The only hope for recovery lay in the hands of FDR, and even still, the American public doubted anything could quite relieve the suffering of the Depression. Luckily for America, the defining moment for FDR had come.
Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
We all remember the phrase, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. But even more important than the phrase was the whole attitude that FDR had. He projected optimism, he projected forward movement, and people felt that's the mystery of leadership, that somehow the depression they were suffering, they weren't going to be in it alone anymore, that they had a leader who was going to take care of it.
Coming into office, Franklin feared nothing, and set out to reinvent the office of the presidency and the rest of the federal government. Though he failed on his first day at the job in capturing the attention of Congress, His temperament allowed him to maintain collectiveness and a determined spirit to push forward. Establishing a nationwide banking holiday, Franklin and Congress achieved a spirit of cooperation in the next 100 days ahead. From there on, Franklin transformed the presidency and the role of Washington's leaders. The president would thereafter have to perform the role of a communicator. Business would have to make room for government in influencing economic life. The government would have to think about the economy on an individual level, and each president would have to demonstrate morally ambitious leadership. One of the primary objectives for Franklin was to charm the socks off the press and transform relationship between the government and the governed. Holding the nation's first press conference, Franklin developed an inside correspondence for the press and instilled a sense of relation between the press and the White House, thus granting the American public an inside look into the activities of the government. Eleanor's press conferences helped to woo and hold women voters, while Sarah's presence served as an everlasting reminder of Franklin's aristocratic roots, and that he would not foolishly throw around ideas without prudent consideration. But perhaps the greatest tool for building their relationship with each American was the installment of fireside chats. The new medium of communication created the image of the president as a member of the American family, while also calming the nation's anxieties over his expansionary economic policy. In his first New Deal, Franklin attacked the condition of the banking system primarily, while continuing conservative budget management. In the Emergency Banking Act, Congress expanded the intervention of the federal government in individual economics, allowing for total authority over credit, foreign exchange, and gold purchases. The act would arouse investor confidence once more, and ultimately set a precedent for the interpersonal relationship between the federal government, capitalism, and the individual. Franklin's ultimate plan was recovery, not relief. But to attain that long-term recovery, he provided for immediate relief from the depression in the NIRA, which established the NRA, PWA, CCC, and FARA. Washington thus embraced a peacetime industrial policy to fight the depression by directly supervising the economy and putting millions to work. The NRA also constituted two of Franklin's most psychologically prized values, work and conservation. The AAA, though later declared unconstitutional, established the principle that Washington bore responsibility for farm prices and should pay farmers to create scarcity. Although much of the major legislation Franklin signed into law failed to whip the Depression quickly, it certainly promised to bless future generations. Many of it also represented social reform across the boards, as Franklin, spited by his Hyde Park neighbors in the past, sought to install new government initiatives to dishearten the spirit of aristocratic industrial bosses across America. The Wagner Act represented an unprecedented amount of federal assistance to labor, while the SEC uniformly regulated private enterprise. And while it did not come into fruition during the first 100 days, Social Security was certainly in the works at the time. The idea of Social Security introduced the idea of federal appropriations to the elderly and disabled, as well as direct aid to the unemployed. In this, Franklin retracted entitlement programs, as in those for veterans, and submitted a deeply meaningful public commitment to the ownership society, or government welfare. Domestic stimulation of the economy materialized in Franklin's decision to take the U.S. off of the gold standard, displaying his desire for federal government to completely authorize the well-being of the national economy. This was extended in his greatest experiment, the TVA. The experimentation of the era thus profoundly nationalized the economy and deprivatized investments and trust in business. A leftist economy thus surged, with the individual trusting in the strength of the federal government. Though a weak economy lay underneath the grandeur of Franklin's first 100 days, Franklin accomplished more than any other president in inspiring hope, action, and self-respect. His ultimate success came not from the results of his programs, but from the restoration of confidence in the federal government. Accordingly, Alter has proven his argument, in which FDR's revolutionary style of economics and politics, as well as his charming approach in delivering such, did not intend to promote immediate or transcendental success, but rather to forward hope and confidence in the future. In truth, FDR's defining moment was not limited to one act of greatness. In fact, the whole of his 100-day Congress and the continuation of his policies redefined greatness in the scope of history. He was a vessel president, restoring essential elements to the American character, our faith in ourselves, our spirit of experimentation, and our hope for the future. His efforts in doing so defined him and the nation we are today.
But I'm not the type to care, 'cause